Welcome to MTS. We thank, as always, the School of Social Science, Humanities, and Arts and the Leshko Samuelson Foundation for their generous support. Welcome. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tessa Farrell. She did her BA with honors in AI at the University of Groningen. She got her master's cum laude, also in AI, also at the University of Groningen, and is now a postdoc at the Center for the Study of Language at UCSD with many of our colleagues and collaborators. She's doing very interesting and exciting work on language evolution, iterated learning, and gathering data using gamified interfaces, previous work in museums and so forth. And today she's going to talk to us about experiments investigating the emergence of structure and meaning in language. Please join me in welcoming Tessa Verhoef.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for having me here. It's been really great to meet some of you today and to see the campus, and I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about some of the work that I'm going to present. So language is a major characteristic that makes humans uniquely different from other species. But despite its central importance in defining who we are, we still, there's still a lot that we don't know about how language evolved. And there's a whole scientific field devoted to investigating this, and I consider myself a member of that field. So the puzzle that many of us in the field are trying to solve is basically how individual cognitive biases and constraints shape the patterns that we see in language, and how what the kind of processes and mechanisms are that bridge these two. So the way that I and many others approach this is by viewing language as a complex adaptive dynamical system. And within this area, it has been identified that to understand language, we need to at least consider, we need to consider interactions on at least 3 different levels. So the individual learning and the development of a language within one person, cultural evolution of languages themselves, and biological evolution, or the kinds of capacities that we are born with that support our language. So I'm going to focus mostly on cultural evolution, which is about how languages themselves evolve, and it emphasizes how many of the distinctive features that we see in human languages can be seen as adaptations to the context in which language is used and transmitted over generations. So some of the important mechanisms that are involved in the cultural evolution of language are social coordination, or the need to find alignment to agree on a shared communication system, and cultural transmission, or the fact that systems get passed on from generation to generation. These are just two examples, but these mechanisms really emphasize that systems like language do not just spring from the mind of a single individual, but they are really the result of constant reinterpretation and filtering through populations of human minds. So they emphasize how we need to take into account both the individual level and the collective level to understand how language works. And so, as Tecumseh Fitch observed in his 2007 paper, these kinds of micro-level and macro-level processes have been studied actually already a lot more in the field of economics. And Adam Smith used the metaphor of the invisible hand to describe sort of emergent forces in the market economy. So sometimes you can have a situation in which individuals are just trying to maximize their own profit, or they're only acting in their own self-interest, but the sum of their behaviors will result in sort of a global order, or unintentional benefits for the public good. And that makes it look like there is actually central control, or an invisible hand controlling those forces. And so similarly, for language, it has been shown that languages tend to exhibit the appearance of design without there actually being a designer, but that through their own evolution, languages adapt to ensure their own survival. So with this, you can think of things like to be faithfully transmitted, they must be learnable, or to be useful for communication, they must be shared and functional. So in terms of language evolution experiments, roughly there have been two different sorts of methods that have been used. One thing that many people have done in these kinds of experiments is to run communication games in which participants communicate in pairs or in small groups about a small set of concepts, and they often use a medium that avoids using language. So they use drawings, for instance, or something like that. And then there have also been lots of experiments that use iterative learning, which basically simulates in the lab the process of transmission. So a person is asked to learn an artificial language, a small language, and then they are asked to reproduce that language. And then the next person coming into the lab is exposed to those reproduction of their predecessor, of the previous person. And that's then repeated a couple of times to create these transmission chains. And of course, combinations of these methods are possible too. And in most of the experiments I'll discuss today, that's what I did too. So basically, these language evolution lab experiments have shown very robust results in which they demonstrated that important structural design features of language can emerge as a result of the process of cultural evolution and out of these different processes that are involved at different timescales. And so these methods provide a good way to fast forward the evolutionary processes in an experimentally controlled way. So we can look, for instance, at the effect of many different generations of learning and transmission in only a very short time, and with the kind of control that we cannot achieve in the field. So that's what I find attractive about these methods. So today I want to talk about 4 different experiments, and I hope I'm not going to run out of time, but if I do, I will be happy to come back another time. So basically the first 2 will both investigate the influence of cultural transmission on the emergence of phonological and iconic patterning. The third one will look at the role of cognitive biases and social coordination in the emergence of space-time metaphors. The fourth one will explore ways to measure changes in gesture as a consequence of conventionalization. And these last 2 in particular are still really works in progress, so I would really love to get your feedback on those. So I'll jump right in with the first one. So the first experiment I'm going to talk about was part of my PhD work. So I did this together with my 2 PhD advisors, Bart de Boer and Simon Kirby. And basically the goal of the experiment, or we designed this experiment to learn something about the origins of combinatorial structure in speech. So this type of structure describes how meaningless sounds, such as phonemes, are combined into well-formed words or morphemes of a language. So it basically, it requires that there's a discrete set of basic building blocks that are reused in a systematic way, and there are learned constraints on how they can be recombined. So for this experiment, we use the Iterated Learning framework. So as I just described, it's this process of transmission from one person to the next. But in the words of the researchers who have invented that term and done most of the work investigating it, it's the process by which an individual learns a behavior by exposure to another individual's behavior who acquired that behavior in the same way. And it tries to model that in the lab. So I'm going to start with an example of one very influential early study in using this paradigm. And some of you, I'm sure, know about this study already. But it's basically, so Kirby, Cornish, and Smith, they designed this artificial language in which they had some objects, and they had different colors, different shapes, and different movement patterns. And then the words to refer to these objects were just some random strings of syllables, and there was no systematic mapping between the meaning and the form. But then what happened in that experiment is that it got transmitted through this experimental chain, and then this is something that came out at the end. So it's a little hard to see like this, but if we put in some hyphens, it becomes a little bit clearer that here there's actually a lot of structure in the set. So we can see that the first syllable of these words refers to the color. The second refers to the shape. And the last one refers to the movement. So this is a very regular and productive system, and it shows a kind of structure that was not there before. And actually knowing the system, it is possible to know the right form for form meaning mappings that you've never seen before. And this type of structures spontaneously and gradually emerged. So there was no outside designer making that happen. So they were basically one of the first to show with a laboratory experiment that this kind of structure could emerge as a result of the process of cultural transmission. And this type of compositional structure that they studied is often contrasted with combinatorial structure that I talked about before, where there's actually meaningless basic building blocks that are combined, or they're carved out of a continuous signal space and then combined into new words. And both of these together are often listed as one of the basic design features of language. And so the experiment that I'm going to describe focuses on this other level of structure. So, of course, human speech already has this kind of discrete categories and combinatoric rules. So the first thing we had to solve was how do we avoid interference from pre-existing experience with speech. So we needed sort of a novel speech apparatus kind of device that would not have any influence from linguistic experience. And what we did was we used slide whistles. So these are, you might know this as a toy. It's actually just a toy whistle where you can change the pitch by moving the plunger. So in this experiment, our participants were asked to learn and reproduce a whistled language in which the words are produced with a slide whistle. There were 12 different whistle sounds, so it was a really small, tiny language that they had to be able to learn this in an hour. There were no meanings attached to the whistles because we were really interested in this pure combinatorial structure where there's a combination of meaningless elements. And we wanted to control for influences of semantics or compositionality. And there were 4 rounds of learning and recall, in which in the learning phase, they were just exposed to all of these sounds one by one, and they got a chance to immediately imitate them with the whistle. And then in the recall phase, they were not able to listen to them again, but they had to, from memory, in the order they preferred, just whistle all of these sounds. And so we ran 4 parallel chains of 10 participants, where basically each person in a chain produces their own set of 12 sounds after their training is done, and then the next person in a chain is exposed to their previous person's output. And so as the initial whistle set that we gave to the first person, we just tried to combine together some sounds that exhibited minimal combinatorial structure. So here are some examples that I've plotted as pitch tracks, and I'm going to play them. So we just try to have like a large variety of different sounds where there was all these just like different techniques, differences in complexity, and all those things. But then to see what happens if when language is transmitted, we can look at the set of sounds that is produced by the last person in a chain. So here's one example from one chain, and just by looking at it like that, you can already see that there's a lot less variation. So it's very it looks a lot more structured. And then if we analyze the structure that's there, we can see that there's clearly a set of basic building blocks. So there are these short level tones, then these falling and rising slides, or just falling slides. And that's basically all the elements there is. And these elements seem to also be systematically reused and combined. And the system seems to become more constrained, so there's really a lot less variation. And so this happened kind of in all 4 of these chains, but each of them looked quite different. So there were sort of distinct traditions for each of these. So to see if these languages were actually sorry,
just a quick question about the experiment itself. I missed. Were they trying to communicate something across the generations, or were they just simply making noises?
Yeah. So no, it was this task was not communicative. So it was really they were told that they were learning a language, and there was like a little alien figure in the screen that was like teaching them, so to say, but it was not interactive. So they were really, it was just learning and reproduction. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So to see, but we just wanted to figure out in a quantitative way if these languages were actually sort of adapting to people's learning. So we wanted to see if they were actually getting easier to learn. And whether people's ability to recall them would improve over time. So we defined a whistle distance measure by looking at the derivative dynamic time warping distance. So dynamic time warping is an algorithm for measuring similarity between 2 temporal sequences that may have similar patterns, but they are not exactly realized in the same way. So there might be variations in time or speed. So that's the way we compared individual signals, and then to compute a distance between 2 sets of whistles, we paired the whistles of 2 sets in all possible ways, and then computed the distance between these paired signals and took the lowest sum of distances. So it's basically finding the most ideal pairing between the different whistles, and then the sum of these distances. And then for each participant, we compared the input set that they got with the output they produced. And this is what we found. So here it shows the recall error and how it progressed down the chain. So generations are on the horizontal axis, and we found a significant decrease of recall error. So that suggests that learnability, or at least the reproducibility of the system, increased over time. And so we also wanted to see if we could find somehow a measure for quantifying this combinatorial structure. So we thought of the idea that combinatorial structure implies more efficient coding and compressibility. So if there's more structure, it means that basically a larger set of signals can be reconstructed from a smaller set of basic building blocks, which makes it more compressible. So we measured entropy to operationalize this. So if the entropy goes down, that basically means that there's more order and more efficient coding. So what we did with each whistle sound that a person produced, we first divided them into segments, and quite arbitrarily we just chose basically the silences to be segment boundaries. You could do that in many different ways, but that's what we did. And then over all the segments, all these different very small segments in a set of 12 whistles, we then did a clustering, like hierarchical clustering, to group together those segments that were very similar according to that distance measure I described before. So then we ended up with a set of basic building blocks, and we computed entropy over those building blocks. And this is what we found. So again, generations on the horizontal axis, and we see that entropy drops over time. So this basically, it suggested that combinatorial structure increased. So just to quickly summarize, in addition to what was found before, that you could get compositional structure to emerge in the lab with in this transmission chain design. We showed here that combinatorial structure can also emerge through the same process. And in this simple experiment, we could already see that these artificial languages really changed gradually when they were transmitted. And so these systems of continuous signals became more learnable, more producible, more reproducible, and more efficiently coded. And there seemed to be sort of this decrease of unpredictable variation. So there was really a lot less possible in these sets. So yeah, basically the emergence of these basic elements and constraints on the way that they could be combined really limited the possibilities and made it more predictable and more recognizable as well. And these sort of distinct traditions emerged. Okay, before maybe I'll take a few questions if there are some about this experiment before I move on to the next one. So if anyone has pressing questions about these results. No, then I'll just move on. Okay, so that first experiment really focused on structure in the signal structuring in the signal of language basically. So, but of course, these signals usually have meanings too, and in that experiment that was not there at all. And humans are not only very skilled pattern recognition machines, but they are also really good at generating meanings. So they're really good meaning generators. So in the next experiment, we actually wanted to include this meaning factor. And this is a joint work with Mark Dingemansen and Sean Roberts from the Max Planck Institute. And here we looked at whistles and iconicity in iterated communication games. So here we also did add this interactive component. So one very powerful device for creating meaning is in languages is iconicity, where there's basically perceived resemblance between form and meaning. So and iconic form meanings have been described to be very widespread in languages, not only in sign languages where it's maybe more obvious, but in many spoken languages too. There's a whole class of very iconic words. So in this experiment, we wanted to see if we could figure out how do iconicity and structure co-emerge. So we wanted to investigate the initial emergence of iconic forms in an experiment in languages with both more mappable and less mappable meanings, and to track the systematic reuse of iconic strategies. And wanted to show that iconicity can sometimes contribute to the shaping of structure in artificial languages. So in this case, the design was a little bit different. Like I said, we added interaction. So the first pair basically had to invent words for meanings by playing guessing games. So they had to try to have their partner guess the meanings. And then after that, basically what they produced in their last interaction round was given to the next pair as input. So the next two participants both were trained first, and then they had a similar type of interaction round before that was transmitted again. So this experiment we ran not with actual whistles, but with an interface that we ran on Samsung tablets. We ran this in a museum, so we wanted it to be portable, and with the real whistles it was just too complicated or not practical to do that in a museum. So we created this application that people could use with two tablets that were wirelessly connected to each other, and where participants could use their finger by sliding over what we call a beep bar or beep buis in Dutch. It's just this bar makes sounds when you slide over it, sort of similar sounds to the whistle. I think I even have an example. And we told them a story that they were that they were, I think, aliens that landed in the ocean on Earth, and they had to communicate about these animals in the ocean with a partner. So yeah, like I said, we did this in a museum, and it was part of a night of art and science in a museum in the Netherlands. And yeah, I just want to kind of promote doing this kind of research because it was really a lot of fun, and in one night we tested 200 participants. So it's a really great way to really quickly and in a really fun way pilot a new experiment, and also at the same time do a kind of outreach and tell people about your work. And so we tested 200 participants, which resulted in 10 different transmission chains. So that's also significantly more than I was able to do with the first experiment I did. And of course, you don't have the same control that you have in the lab. So there's noise in the environment. People often knew each other, so there were usually friends who were participating together. The task had to be really short, so this took, I think, 15 minutes at the most, which of course limits the design that you can do. And it was a nighttime festival, so participants were, towards the end of the night, probably significantly more tired and perhaps more likely to be intoxicated as well. I don't know, but as you can see, people really loved it, and yeah, it was for us a really great experience. And still, the data wasn't messy enough that we couldn't actually analyze it. So okay, so the meanings in this experiment were just 4 different meanings. Seahorses either facing left or facing right, or eels facing either left or facing right. And some of these were really easily paired with an iconic form to the medium of communications, while others were a little bit more difficult to map. So the eels, for instance, you can imagine you can just follow the shape. Those would be two very obvious signals that you could do for the eels, but for the seahorses that's a little bit more difficult. So there were 2 learning rounds in which they saw each item twice and heard the sound that belonged to it. And then there were 2 interaction rounds in which they had some buttons with which they could record their sounds and send them to each other, or replay a sound if their partner had sent them one. And so this is what an example of what such an interaction looked like. So here's what each of the 2 people in the pair saw on their screen. One of them takes the role of the speaker, and the other the listener, and they just keep switching roles all the time. So basically, the speaker is first presented with a target meaning that they have to communicate, and then they create a signal, and they send it to their partner. Now the listener sees on their screen that they received a signal from their partner, and they can play it, and then they have to make a choice. And then both of them receive feedback, so that's how they can learn from their interactions too. So first we just wanted to see if there was any effect of this mappability on the success of communicating these meanings. So basically here it shows the percentage guessed correctly for each of the meanings. And what we found was that there was an overall effect both for animal and for the facing direction. So the eels were, as expected, more often guessed correctly than the seahorses. But also the animals facing right were more often correctly guessed than the animals facing left. And that seems weird maybe in the beginning, but when we thought about it a little bit more, it actually makes sense because following the shape of the animal is not really the only strategy that you could use. So another strategy would be to look at where the direction the animal is swimming in. And in this case, they're both kind of swimming down, just because they happen to have eyes makes you see that. So, and then you basically get the same signal as before for the animal that is swimming to the right, but also that signal for the animal that is swimming to the left. So there, that basically makes that between the two mappable ones, one is actually a little bit more predictable than the other. So here we wanted to see if they are actually using this iconic strategy that we thought they would, or that we thought was the most obvious for them to do. So we plotted the mean signal computed on the basis of the successful trials, and it shows this expected pattern. So of following the shape, actually. But as you can see, it is a little bit stronger in the eel that is swimming to the right than in the eel that is swimming to the left. So here we can look at some of these individual languages or solutions that people came up with. And we can see that there are some really systematic patterns, and that they also are quite similar across the pairs. So here, basically, the animals facing left all start low and end high, and the animals facing right all start high and end low. And then there's just a difference in complexity between the eels and the seahorses. Here, something similar is happening. They just add a few dots for the seahorses. This again is quite a similar type of strategy. And again, so these are all examples from different dyads. So these are all these are not people that interacted with. So the basically the signal for the seahorses here is not by itself iconic, because it's not immediately clear which way, whether it would have to go up or down for the animal facing left or right. But it only makes sense basically by similarity to the signals that are there for the eels. And also the fact that there's more complexity for the seahorses is only iconic in contrast to the eel. So it basically makes the signals for the seahorses sort of motivated and meaningful as part of the system. Well, just by themselves, they're not really iconic per se. So with respect to this difference in complexity, we also looked at that more widely to see if there was a difference, and we measured complexity in two different ways. So the first one on the left shows the number of finger lifts. So we looked at how often did they actually lift their finger while creating a signal, so how many different segments did they create. And the second one is the proportion of zero velocity. So how often did they stop moving and either change direction or added another movement trajectory in the same direction to that as a sort of a measure of complexity of the signals. And we can see that it's in both cases the complexity is higher for the seahorses than for the eels, as expected. But what we could also see is if we look at this over generations, that this it shows that the difference between the structure of the signals increases over time. So it's only really towards the end that there's this really clear contrast, and this iconic contrast on the basis of complexity is therefore something that seems to be emerging gradually, and it's being used to scaffold the other meanings. So here we show how such a signum gradually develops over time. So we can see that in the first two rounds there doesn't really seem to be a clear distinction yet between animals facing left or animals facing right. So it's just basically the same for the both seahorses and the same for both eels. But then one, or the most obvious strategy emerges for the eels. And then we can see that one generation later that's sort of adopted for the seahorses as well. So just a quick conclusion. In this experiment we saw that iconic strategies were used to a great extent, that they were also reused and combined in a kind of a compositional way, and we saw the emergence of iconic patterns. So it shows how iconicity can really shape structure and might form the basis of emerging productive patterns. So this fits with an observation that which was proposed before, mostly in the context of sign language, that there may be a competition between different types of iconicity that languages exploit in order to organize their grammars. And what we wanted to show is that this organization might happen due to language use and transmission over time. Okay. So the meanings in the previous study were all pretty imageable and concrete, and determining what was mappable or less mappable was quite straightforward in that experiment. But every day we also talk about things like power or mathematics or time, which are much more abstract and intangible. So together with Tyler Margedes and Esther Walker, we've been working on some experiments where we wanted to see how cognitive biases and social coordination may be involved when we develop systems to talk about time. So one reason it may be a little harder to develop a system to talk about abstract things is that we don't really have any perceptually shared reference for such concepts. So, but what has been found before is that one common way that people communicate about these abstract concepts is by spatializing them, or by recycling the language of space. So here are some examples. So you can, for instance, say he's at the top of the corporate ladder, or the number 7 is higher than 5, or many children cannot count down from 10. Or I look forward to the weekend and the worst is behind us. So yeah, we often recruit spatial words to communicate about abstract things like time. And there have been a few proposals to explain how that works, or why that might be the case. So some argue that we have innate biases to associate space, time, and number because they use shared resources, neural resources. Others have argued that a variety of abstract domains, including time, share structural and relational features with space, so that they can actually be easily aligned. And a third one shows that regularities in experience might create these cross-domain associations. And so it has also been shown that all these existing theories are not necessarily contradictory, and that each of them may play a role. But it has also been argued by Nunez and Cooperrider recently that none of their own can really account for the combination of universality and variability that we see in space-time mappings in the languages of the world. And they suggested that we might need to look at mechanisms that operate at different timescales. And they mentioned as examples individual biases, local cultural norms, and cultural evolution. So we thought that this would actually be a really good domain for studying this with the kinds of methods that have been used in language evolution before. So we used an experimental approach to explore sort of a hybrid account in which individual biases are elaborated and entrenched through social interaction and transmission. So in this experiment, we invited 8 pairs of participants, and we asked them to interact about concepts of time using a novel communication device, which I will explain in a minute. And none of them knew each other beforehand. So they were sitting in separate rooms with the doors closed, so they couldn't interact in any other way than through this device that we made them use. And they were sitting in front of touchscreen computers that were connected over the internet so that they could send each other signals. So the way they had to communicate was through this vertical sort of touch device or spatial movement signaling device. So it's very much like the beep bar from the previous experiment, but in this case it didn't make any sound, but it translated these movements into the movement of this, this bubble. And we used the vertical axis because we thought that English, like native English adults, didn't use this axis systematically for time. So, for instance, we all use Facebook, and in there you have the new things come on top. While, for instance, in your calendar, the future is going down, and even within Facebook, I think the comments work the other way around again. So we thought that with respect to whether the future or later events are up or down, we thought that people wouldn't have very strong preferences. They may have some preferences, but they may differ a little bit per person. So we asked them to communicate about time concepts. So this was our meaning space. Basically, there were 18 different meanings. They kind of differed in temporal extent, from very short moments to unlimited periods, and we had these different classes of time. So duration time, sequence time, and deictic time, where also we had basically different ordering. So we had future, now, and past events. So you can see that, especially across the categories here, there are some that might be very tricky to tell apart. So, for instance, year before and last year, or day and today, are really conceptually already very similar. So imagine having to communicate about that with a bubble bar. So this is what the interaction looked like on the screen. So there were two players, obviously, and the first player was presented with a concept, and they were asked to create a signal. So they could press record, and then create a signal. It might be quite hard to see the bubble in here, actually, but there is like a bubble under the finger that's moving with the finger. So and then once they record it, they can send it to their partner, and then their partner will get a message that shows them that they can play a new signal. So they play it. Yeah, this might be very hard to see, but it basically just follows the movement that the other person created with their finger. And then they were asked to make a choice out of these 18 options. And then again, both participants were presented with feedback. So in this case, participants completed 4 interaction rounds. All 18 items appeared in each round. And there were alternating roles of signaler and guesser. So they switched roles every time, one after the other. And the items were presented in a random order, but we ensured that each participant was the signaler for each item twice. So after 2 rounds, basically, both participants were the signaler for each item once. So then we wanted to see, can people actually successfully communicate about these concepts using this device? Well, they can. Actually, from the start, people already perform a little bit above chance, but the performance does dramatically increase after the first 2 rounds. And this might be because after that, each participant had the chance to be both the guesser and the producer for a signal. But you can also see that it's not perfect, so they don't solve this game perfectly. And then we wanted to see whether participants actually communicated about these concepts in systematic ways. So I'm going to show some representations of the signals they made, plotted as a picture. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like. So here, that's kind of how it translates. So I'm just plotting the location where the bar was touched, against time. So what we could see was that there were very similar patterns to distinguish durations across the different pairs. So here, for instance, for seconds, or things that were close only to a second long, they would do things that were very short and maybe have like a very tiny movement in the middle. For things like day, it was always a little bit more. They used a little bit more space, but still not the whole bar. And then for year, often the whole bar was used. So these were really things that people did from the start. So it was kind of already there from the beginning. So it seems to be that it comes from a really like early shared bias, or it's something that emerged early because people had very shared expectations about it. So then what we also saw was that a lot of systematicity occurred in the location and direction of the bar related to the past or future events. And some pairs decided that the past was down and the future was up, like these examples. But this is not what always happened. So there were actually an equal number of pairs in our experiment that had the future down and the past up. And so that shows that it's not as biased as, for instance, the left-right or front-back axis in English speakers, which is what we expected. But even then, within a pair, they were very systematic. So they did almost always, or actually always, they came up with a way of making this distinction. So then, to measure these kinds of systematicities, we basically wanted to see if features of the signal actually predicted the meaning. So to measure this, we looked at internal systematicities and to see if we could quantify that by relating meaning similarity to signal similarity. So basically, the idea that meanings that share either the temporal extent or direction in terms of future or past, that they will have a similar signal. So we quantified this by measuring a correlation between the signal distance between all possible pairs of signals in a system and the pairwise semantic distance between the associated target meanings. So for this, we had to define basically a semantic distance and a signal distance. So for the semantic distance, we looked basically at three different things: duration, order, and class. So for duration, we looked at whether, basically we defined that short is further apart from year than day is in terms of duration. For order, we looked at, basically the order, so past is not the same as now and is even further away from future. And for class, we just defined they're not in the same class, they're different, basically. So here's an example for if we compare the meaning now with the meaning year after, this is what it would look like. So for duration, it would be a difference of 2. For order, it would be a difference of 1. For class, they're not the same class, so they're a difference of 1 as well. And then our overall semantic distance was basically a sum of these. So that's how we defined the semantic distance. And then for signal distance, we try to use a sort of a very rudimentary way of describing the signal. So we basically summarized it down to only 2 dimensions, where we looked at both the peak of the spatial density, which basically just means where on this bar were they touching the most. So what was the peak of the density of the touch that happened during that item, and the proportion of total space used. So were they using only very little space of the bar, or were they using like the whole range of the bar? And so then we can take all these signals and plot them in this space. And then our signal distance was basically just the Euclidean distance between these items. So what we wanted to see was whether something like a situation in which meanings that are related in semantic space are sort of randomly scattered around this space, whether those would get more organized at some point, where similar meanings get similar structure. So that's what this measure did. And what we found is that the structure in this case increases over rounds. So each point here represents a system that was used by a particular round by one pair, and the dotted line indicates the upper limit of the 95% confidence interval for random data. So basically, values above this have a significant amount of internal structure, or that are significantly different from random. And you can see that by the end, almost all of the systems had more structure than we would expect by chance. And so what we already saw before is that overall people guessed correctly more often in later rounds. But we can also look at the incorrect items to see if these reflect sort of that people were getting becoming aware of the structure. So if their wrong guesses were actually closer in semantic space, then that means that that the signals did give them some clue in the right direction, and we could indeed see that this decreased over round. So here each dot is again one pair, and errors became gradually more systematic. So their incorrect guesses became gradually more close to the target meaning. So just to summarize, what we saw is that consistent mappings between sort of the size of the signal space and temporal extent emerged across pairs. And this was something that emerged very early, and also was very similar across the different pairs. At the same time, we also saw that there were consistent mappings for place or direction on this bar to the future, past, or now. But this varied a lot more from pair to pair, and it indicates that this seems to be more due to the interaction history, or it sort of emerged more as idiosyncratic conventions. And there was an overall improvement in communicative success. So people could actually kind of do this. And this is, again, why we thought that this happens. So, however, these emergent systems were never completely compositional or perfectly communicative. So there were still, I think the highest communicative success was still kind of 50%. So most people still had a lot of trouble to distinguish the different classes of temporal meanings most of the time. So things like day and today, or next year and year after, were still very hard. So what we tried to do next is to see where so we thought maybe these sort of more wider systematicities may require a pressure from this transmission effect as well. So what we did next was, or this is actually something that we're still working on right now, is to have 2 new participants come in and have them both trained on the words that were used in the last interaction between the previous 2, and create these transmission chains again. See what will happen. So here's just an example. So we're still in the process of collecting this data. So this is just a single example of what happened in one chain. But here we can see what a pair in the first generation, what their accuracy was over time, over the 4 rounds. And this looks very similar to those graphs that I showed before for the individual pairs that we had in the previous experiment. But then once we arrive at the 8th generation, we can see that it looks very different, and that actually the pair in the 8th generation, already in their first interaction round, they performed better than than the ones in the first generation did in their last round. And all the rounds after that, they just do 100% correct. So it really shows that transmissions seem to really improve the learnability, which increased even more the structure and made people end up in actually almost perfect accuracy throughout the whole experiment. So here, just to show like what that system looked like that they created, that they were using. So basically, past, now, and future were very clearly distinguished from each other. The past was down and the future was up, and now is in the middle. And they also had a clear strategy to distinguish those from before and after. So they before matched past in location, but the signal was different. They introduced this squiggle. And then for day and year, we indeed see this contrast in the use of space. So it's kind of a similar signal, but year takes up a lot more space. And then we see that for yesterday, today, tomorrow, day before, and day after, they basically make these sort of sequenced combinations of these items. So the yesterday starts with the first part of the signal of day, and then goes to end as past. For today, it starts as day, it ends as now. Tomorrow starts as day, ends as future. Day before starts as day, ends like before, and so on. And then the same pattern is there for year, but yeah, all with a larger use of space. So this is very, very systematic and combinatorial. So yeah, like I said, this is still very much a work in progress, so I would love to hear what you think. But we just wanted to see if it is feasible to design an experiment that takes into account interacting constraints on multiple levels, and perhaps show that the emergence of spatial metaphors in language can be due to these interacting mechanisms. And by focusing on the interaction of mechanisms that operate on these different timescales, we hope that these types of laboratory experiments can also shed light on the commonalities and variety found in space-time mappings in languages around the world. Maybe I'll stop again and see if there's any questions about this experiment before do I have more time actually to talk about another one?
Yeah, it's okay.
Okay,
yeah.
cool. Yeah.
I have two really quick questions. So in this follow-up to the time communication experiment, did you test any pairs of participants with the same number of trials as the generations would have gone? I'm just curious whether it's really effective transmission versus the much larger amount of training.
Yeah, I see what you mean. So the task was basically the same for these. So the two graphs that I shown, they were both they had exactly the same length of task, but it is true that like a lot more happened to that system over time. So what they get exposed to has already been used and transmitted before, which is kind of what we want to show that influences it. Yeah, but the interaction rounds were exactly the same length. So the experiment basically just took longer in the later version of it. Yeah, it was about an hour and a half in the end with the training included. Yeah.
And then, did you ever interrogate the participants after they completed the experiment to figure out whether they were doing this very intentionally or whether they were trying to systematize the communication?
Yeah, we did ask them afterwards, and usually they could describe what they were doing very well. So they were they could say, yeah, the future was up, and then it was like this kind of squiggle for that item, or and we also we asked them sort of more targeted question of how did you distinguish between the day after and tomorrow or something, and usually those things they had a harder time, at least in the experiment with the pairs, they had a much harder time describing that.
You might have stated this, but how much time took place between each generation of transmission?
So that it kind of depended on when participants were coming in. So some days it could be right after, or it could be in a week later. So but they were never actually training each other. So we were basically just taking the signals that were produced in the last interaction round of one pair, and then the training of the next pair started with exposure to that system. So we never actually had to have people come back to teach the others or something. Yeah.
Okay. So, what's going on here, right, is you're having people come up with spatial analogies for well-defined, agreed-upon concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And so they both know all the sort of set of concepts that they're drawing from. So they just have to use the analogy, the spatial information to figure out which of these things does the other person mean. So how do you think that relates to the emergence of language in more naturalistic populations, where it's not only the signals but also the meanings that have to emerge?
Yeah, I totally agree that that's. So here we really focus on what happens to the signals, but you're completely right that in real life situations that you also have to figure out what is actually important to be able to talk about or to be able to reference to. So I think it has been, so I think, for instance, with that first experiment by Kirby, Cornish, and Smith, that was one concern that many people had, where they said, yeah, but you already sort of, there's so much structure in your meaning space, so you kind of build in this idea of the structure by having that already be there in the meaning space. And I think with the experiment that I showed before with the whistles, where there was no meaning actually attached to it, that kind of showed that even without that kind of structure in the meaning space already built in, you can still get structure in the signal space. But I do agree that this is, of course, it's just a solution. They're creating a solution for a game that they have to solve.
I actually want to push back on that idea that there's no meaning in the sounds of the whistles. I think there are a lot of meanings. Like if I go like wah, wah, like that has like nobody thinks like, oh, that signifies everything is great.
No, yeah, of course, yeah. No, I agree with that. And also one thing with that experiment that I think is interesting is that, so people have criticized that for the fact that I'm saying I'm studying phonological structure, but phonology is also based on minimal pairs and what kind of contrasts in meanings it can create. So how can you study that without actually including meanings? But I think there's another way in which there is actually meaning in there, is that they are different words. So they have to, people know that they're actually different. Yeah, they have to, there is distinctions there in that sense. So, yeah.
So thinking of this in terms of the emergence or coming upon this explanation or like coming upon a solution, as you said, and I'm worrying that the space-time mappings, as found so often in the metaphors and things like that, are less of them inventing the solution instead of just kind of rediscovering this thing that is already present in language, right? So we talk about things moving in time or things like that, or like something short taking up less space and things like that. So it seems like maybe this isn't something that's emerging from the subjects, maybe, if that makes any sense. So this might be more interesting in a case where that mapping isn't something that they can discover so much from their language, or maybe in a language that doesn't use that so much.
So you're saying like to use maybe different participants with different language backgrounds that may have different biases or something about this?
Just maybe that this space-time mapping that they're doing is already something that the language would support them coming across. Like they're not coming up with their shared structure on their own, but they are using their culture already to show that this is a thing. Like it's already deeply entrenched, right?
Yeah, no, sure. I agree that so yeah, they are definitely using biases that they had already before from language or their previous experience with using calendars and all these kinds of things that in our culture already spatialize time. But I think one really interesting thing about this was that there was still a difference in the types of patterns that we saw. So some of these, the ones with temporal extent and duration, was that one seemed to emerge really early. So people seem to have very, very strong preferences about that already, and used that immediately to make their partner guess, and that immediately worked also. While for these things like best up or down, or future up or down, that was a little bit different. So there they really had to negotiate and come up with a system, with a shared system between them. That was not something that was there immediately from the beginning. So I think, that both of these things were playing a role, and I think in sort of interesting ways. Yeah. So I'll quickly move on to the next experiment then. So basically, all the previous studies that I've shown were all using a signaling modality that is not very natural for humans to use for language. So it's not things that we actually have real languages in, which makes it a little bit harder to compare to real language situations maybe sometimes. And this may be one of the reasons why there has been an increased interest in the field of language evolution to use gesture in these kinds of language evolution experiments. So natural languages do exist in the manual modality, sign languages, but most hearing participants do not have experience with sign language. So that makes it a sort of an ideal, novel, but also natural modality to use. But one difficulty with it is that it's much harder to measure and quantify than those other devices that I've used. So in this experiment, together with my collaborators at UC San Diego, we wanted to measure changes in gesture as a consequence of conventionalization in an interactive game. And the specific question we were interested in was, what effects do repetition and familiarity have on the forms of communicative silent gestures, and how can such effects be quantified? And we used Microsoft Kinect, by the way. I forgot to say that, but to measure this. So basically, a bit of background. So in speech, we know that repeated references contain fewer words, which are also phonetically reduced. So in other words, we know that in a conversation, words that are more predictable are given less acoustic prominence. And kind of in a similar way, co-speech gestures about given information reduce in number, size, and precision. And similarly for sign languages, it has been shown that phonetic reduction involves changes in size and precision over time, when languages evolve over time. So basically very predictable or very often repeated signs are also are smaller and less precise than their citation forms or their dictionary forms, the way they are described. So here's an example from American Sign Language. So the sign for religion used to be all the way like this, but that has reduced between 1923 to its current form to something like this, which is way smaller. So as the sign has been repeated, it basically shrunk over time. And in American Sign Language, this type of process has been described for many different signs over time. So it seems to be sort of a general process that affects conventional signs in established sign languages. So basically, both within the context of a single conversation and also on a much larger scale within established sign languages, we see that this repetition and familiarity will lead to reductions in form. But so far, we haven't really been able to measure that, or at least we will want to offer one way to try to measure this. So what we did was we used the Microsoft Kinect, which is a body tracking device that is designed for video gameplay, to record people's gestures while they were playing a multi-round charades-like guessing game. And we had 10 pairs of participants that basically took turns gesturing to refer to 32 imageable English nouns. So these were the nouns that they had to communicate about. So we kind of picked some from 4 different categories: animals, professions, shapes, and sports. And yeah, basically just because we wanted them to be able to do this with gesture, and we expected that maybe in these different categories you would see some different strategies. So for shapes you would expect a lot of tracing. For sports you would expect a lot of acting out. For animals, maybe people would become the animal and put like ears or like an elephant trunk on their body. Yeah, so that's why. So our participants had to help their partners guess each of these 32 nouns over 4 different rounds. And in the first round, they were still able to use speech, but in the 3 rounds after that, they could only use gestures. And these last 3 rounds are the only ones that we're actually going to look at right now. So probably most of you have seen the Kinect before, but this is what it looks like, or at least this is what the previous version looks like, which is what we used, but the new version looks different, I think. So it has a regular camera and also an infrared depth sensor. And so roughly this is how it works. So let's say that this is our scene. It will then project an infrared depth field onto that scene, which we cannot see with our eyes, but the infrared camera in the Kinect can see it, and it gets an image back with basically a distorted dot pattern. And the software that comes with Kinect can then estimate distances to object in the scene on the basis of the displacement of those dots. And from that, it also looks for human-shaped objects in particular. And then once it has found a human-shaped object, it can also figure out the locations of the different joints on that human. So this was what our setup looked like. So we had one person, the gesture, in front of the Kinect, and then we had the other person was controlling the computer. Only the gesture could see what was on the screen, so that the screen showed the item that they had to gesture about, and the guesser had to guess it and then move on to the next item. Like that. And then after half a round, they would switch places. So here's one example. Maybe you can guess what this person is gesturing about.
Bird.
Bird, yeah. So this is what that looked like in round 2, but then we can also see what that looked like in round 4. So at least subjectively, it already looks quite a lot smaller and less crisp. So then, of course, Kinect gives us depth information, so we can also look at it in 3 dimensions. So here we just try to plot what that looks like and try to trace what the wrists were doing over time. So here we basically just see the paths traveled by the wrist during one item, and in this case that's bird. And what we then did was to basically look at the boundaries of that space and draw a box around it. And that would give us the volume of the gesture space for that item. So that's just like one way to kind of quantify what their gesture space was like. And so here you can see, if we compare that bird gesturing around 2 with the bird gesturing around 4, you can again see that it's quite a lot smaller in round 4. So here's a graph showing basically for each participant how their volume for the items changed over the 3 gesture rounds. So each dot here is basically one different item that they had to gesture about. And we can show that over rounds it significantly decreases in So another way to measure this kind of reduction would just be to look at the distance traveled by the hands. So now we can just basically keep track of what that trace is, and then basically just measure its length. And for that different measure, we kind of find the same thing. So also here, over rounds for most participants, there's a clear decrease in the distance traveled by the hands. So these two measures broadly sort of confirm the earlier discussion about the relationship between repetition, familiarity, and reduction. So it seems to be the case that in the development of a shared set of communicative symbols, these gestures arrive at forms that are elaborate enough to be understood still, but are also noticeably shorter and more relaxed than their initial attempts. So another thing we tried to measure was distalization. Do I have time still?
We're running a little short, but maybe a couple more minutes.
Okay, so maybe I'll just skip this one because this is a little bit complicated to explain. But if anyone's interested in distalization in particular, I would be happy to talk about that later. Okay, basically, as a sort of overall discussion of this last study, as we expected, we find that silent gestures did indeed used in communication games can reduce in ways that are familiar from conventionalization in sign language. And with the Kinect, we basically have we found it a very useful tool to unobtrusively measure aspects of silent gestures elicited in a controlled experimental context. So it's that you don't need much, you don't have to put any electronics on people to do this. And we have here used this tool to examine a relatively fine-grained aspect of gestural production that is much harder to code by hand. So by just looking at 2D video, you can't really tell space in 3D. But it's also important to remember that it's still limited as well. So some things that it cannot get yet is, for instance, facial expression, which is in the context of sign language research actually a very important thing. And the same for hand shape, which both for gesture and for sign language is very important. I do think though that maybe the new version is a bit better at this, but so far we haven't been able to do that. But we hope to have shown that at least aspects of movement can indeed be easily quantified. And we hope that it can also be used to ask other sort of targeted questions in both sign and gesture. So working with the Kinect provided us with new opportunities to define measurements of bodily movements, and I just want to emphasize again that this is just one way of operationalizing this kind of reduction. There's probably many different ways you can do this, but at least with these two, we could show the same kind of effect. And that these kinds of measurements you can define can translate to phenomena that are of shared interest in the fields of gesture and sign language research. So, sort of as a sort of grand summary, all the kinds of experiments that I have shown are basically these experiments that are disguised as games and often quite fun for participants to do. And they can shed light on how these micro-level individual behaviors, whether that is to learn a set of whistle words or to make a partner guess a concept, can in very interesting and sometimes unpredictable ways shape interesting observable phenomena at the macro level, such as the emergence of various kinds of structure or a systematic reduction over time in gesture. Thank you very much.